Good start.
Okay.
Okay, welcome everybody. Today is June 18th, 2023, and welcome to our Afternoon at the Museum speaker series. And we are fortunate to have Victoria Grageda-Smith here today to talk about her new book, The Thomasite. And we will have her go through her presentation, and then we'll have questions and answers afterwards. You can either put them into the chat, and then and don't put any spoilers. If you've read the book, no spoilers, so that we can find out on our own. So we thank you all for coming. This will end up being on our museum's YouTube page so that more people can watch it later at their leisure. So thank you all for being here. And Victoria, you're on.
Thank you, Terry. And happy Father's Day, everyone in the United States. And to all those in the Philippines, happy Rizal Day. It may interest some of you to note that the Thomasite is very much inspired by Jose Rizal's novels, Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. And but I want to backtrack a bit and thank the FANHS Museum for this precious opportunity to share the Thomasite with the world, and including specifically Elena. She was the first one to reach out to me. Thank you, Elena, for noticing. I really treasure this opportunity. And as I would be talking about, this has something to do with my mission as a Filipino-American author. I'll talk more about that later on. But anyway, like I said, this novel is, you could say there's an intertextuality between the Thomasite and Jose Rizal's novels. What that means is there's like a dialogue going on. You can read the Thomasite and know nothing about Jose Rizal or even about his novels. But if you do, it will further enhance your reading of the Thomasite, because there are in fact characters whom you could say are reimaginations or maybe reinterpretations of some of the more iconic characters in Rizal's novels. So I won't say more, but one of these days, I'd love to hear from some of you who you think, for instance, Diego, Santiago in the Thomasite relates to in Noli Me Tangere. Who do you think Toto, for instance, relates to in Noli Me Tangere? And who do you think is Maria Clara in the Thomasite? So I'm just going to shoot. So I'm asking the questions first now. We've like inverted the order of this presentation. We've gone into the question and answer. Anyway, so let me do this, I guess there. So essentially, this is like the structure I came up with for this presentation. And as you can see, there is a balanced mix of history, readings from the book, and images and pictures relevant to the book, and that were very helpful and instrumental for me in writing the book in respect of like, how do I describe this? How do I, what do I say about that? What's the term for this and that? So all of these materials were very helpful to me. But I'm the kind of historical fiction author that really puts a lot of history in my books. In my historical novels, history itself plays a character. And to me, that's the point of historical fiction. And when I say history itself is a character, it's because of historical events that certain characters act the way they do. So they influence the thoughts and actions of the characters, and therefore also act like a character that moves the plot forward. I always try to strive for a balance between history and the plot. As a literary fiction author, of course, I tend more towards character-driven writing, which is the essence of literary fiction. Yet still, I strive for a balance between that and the plot, because most of us like to know, and then what happens next, right? That's always the question from when we were kids, and then what happens next? So that's how I write my books too. Okay. A lot of people ask me where I got the idea for the Thomasite. And like I said in my speech at the Orcas Island Lit Fest that happened a couple of weeks ago, this is gonna date me, but I don't care. I got the idea when I was a 14-year-old high school student in the Philippines, when I learned in our history class about the more than 500 American teachers who came to the Philippines to teach and help establish a secular public education system as an alternative to the public education system that was in place or established by the Spaniards, who were the Philippine Islands' former colonial rulers. So this book, you can say then, is like 47 years in the making. Inspiration for the play setting, that's easy. It's because of my father, who is a Bicolano. His Philippine hometown is Daraga, Albay. And when we were kids, we would spend some of our summers there. He would take us there, and he took us to the most magical places of his youth. And he would fill us with stories of his youthful adventures, which we love to listen to. So like he took us to this cave called the Huyup-Huyupan Cave. And that, in fact, plays a role in the novel, or it is an important place setting in the novel. And the other place he brought us to are the Tiwi Hot Springs, which also plays an important part in the novel. And then what's compelling about this story of the Thomasites that fascinated me so much that I dreamt of writing a book about them is I was thinking, were they crazy, these American teachers? I mean, they came not just by themselves. Some of them actually brought their families, their spouses and their little kids. And I said, they came right smack while the Philippine-American War was still ongoing. I mean, would you go to a country you know nothing about, straight into an ongoing war, to teach children? To me, that was quite admirable. And to me, that impressed me so much. You know, in the Philippines, when you talk about the good American, many people remember the GIs of World War II. We considered them heroes, right? They fought along with Filipinos for freedom against the Japanese, right? But to me, the American Thomasites too were this good American. And in fact, my research would show that they were remembered with much fondness and gratitude by their Filipino students. So to me, the American Thomasites typify the maverick, adventurous American spirit, and the kind of spirit that moves some of us in America to do something for the purpose of being in service of something larger than ourselves. So what's that, right? That's not just a good American, that's a good human being. So that's why I just had to write a story about them. And also, you know, what inspired this novel for me is generally my mission as a Filipino-American author. And what is that? Well, two things. It's number one, to celebrate the shared legacy and history of Filipinos and Americans. And number two, especially as regards writing historical fiction, I'm on a mission. And that mission is this. It is to educate the world about history and culture by entertaining it with compelling, timeless stories, to hopefully inspire an empathetic world toward addressing the contemporary problems and issues of humanity. So that's always behind my writing. And the Thomasite is no less, was created no less because of this. One thing to really remember, I'd like everyone to remember, is the Thomasite is fiction. So I would say that although I did strive to be very authentic and accurate in the historical background on which the book is based, that please remember this is fiction. And if you have the book and go to the back book matter, you would see the QR coded sections on historical notes. And I would cover some of that in this presentation, but go through that to be clear. It's a clarification on what's real and what's fiction. So I hope that helps. So in this presentation, I mainly aim to demonstrate the dynamic relationship between the fictional story and the history on which it's based, and my personal life experiences as inspirations for the Thomasite. And number two, I would love to share insights about my work as a historical novelist using this book as a specific example. I'm sure that some of you are thinking, well, you know, FANHS, what did FANHS want to do in featuring a historical novelist today? You know, so I want to go back to that thing. I asked myself, put myself in your place and say, what would you be interested in knowing from a historical novelist? And so some of those insights I'm going to share during my presentation. So for those of you who don't have the book yet and who haven't read the book, this is essentially what the book's about. The time frame within which everything happens is from July 1901 to May 1903. The epilogue is particularly set during the centennial of the Thomasite's arrival in Manila. And it happens starting in the United States in San Francisco, from where the Thomasites left San Francisco Bay on board the U.S. Army Transport Thomas. That's the name of the ship. And that's why they're called Thomasites, by the way. It's because they sailed on the U.S. Army Transport Thomas. So they sailed from San Francisco Bay, and then they had a stop over in Honolulu, and then they arrived in Manila. And then our heroine, in particular, Eleanor Karsten, is assigned to the fictional town of Magayan, Bicol region, which is inspired by Daraga Albay, my father's hometown. And I'll talk more about why I spell Bicol in the book with a V instead of a B. So our main character is Eleanor Carson. She's a 26-year-old blonde, blue-eyed, unmarried teacher from Iowa. So except for Iowa, I have nothing in common with Eleanor Karsten. And it was really fun imagining myself as Eleanor Karsten. Well, Eleanor, along with more than 500 other teachers, American teachers, answers President McKinley's call to teach Filipino children and help establish a secular system of public education in the new U.S. colony, the Philippine Islands. And I know those of you who are keen scholars of Philippine history, you're always eager to bring my attention to the fact that, oh, but then the Spaniards, don't you know the Spaniards already established a public education system in the Philippines? And that's true. That's true. It's actually covered by the novel. and it will be explained later in one of my readings. I'm going to read a part of the novel that deals with that specifically. So hold your horses. And then so Eleanor, she journeys to her designated school territory, which is the town of Magayan. And there she encounters various challenges. I mean, name it. She faced it. You know, there was malaria, there was a cholera epidemic, there was insurrection, and then there were all these class and racial and religious prejudice and tensions happening all around her. Altogether, testing her resolve to fulfill her mission, which is to establish a school in Magayon, right? A co-educational secular public school. And her patriotic loyalties as an American are tested when she becomes, of course, there's romance in this novel. Who doesn't love a love story? So I had to have a love story. And she becomes romantically entangled with a Filipino. I won't tell you who. Just read the novel. Whom she suspects to be the local leader of the insurrection. Now, I must make it a point that to the Americans, it's called the Philippine insurrection. But to the Filipinos, from the perspective of the Filipinos, it was just a continuation of the Philippine Katipunan Revolution against the Spaniards, and now directed towards the Americans, because the Americans effectively actually wrested victory from us. You know, the Katipuneros were on a momentum where they could actually possibly win the revolution against the Spaniards. And then what does America do? America buys us for $20 million. And all of a sudden, we're a colony of the United States. So Eleanor witnesses the human ramifications of this American, it was then a new policy of expansionism, you know, but which McKinley called benevolent assimilation of Filipinos. And in this milieu, she finds herself the student rather than the teacher. So how's that for a premise for a book, right? I mean, it has everything. Name it. Name an issue or subject matter you're interested about. I bet you it's in the Thomasite. And I challenge you to, you know, to ask me, and I will direct you to that point in the book. Okay, so and as could be seen, you know, these are just a partial list of the themes that you could probably pick out or recognize as you read the book. But I kind of put them on a grid here because I'm concerned not only with individual issues, but with how our individual issues interact dynamically with community and societal issues. So on the one hand, there are characters in the novel who are on a journey. And for some of them, it leads them to some transformation. But then this is all happening within the background of major world historical events, specifically concerning the United States and the Philippines. But also, this is like the new world of the new imperialists. You know, the old imperialists were Portugal and Spain, right? And the Dutch and the British. But now America is entering the world scene. And so this is all happening. And how do these historical events affect large populations so as to bring social change? So I'm interested in those dynamics. And then, of course, you have, on the one hand, people falling in love with each other, right? And then this is all happening against war, such opposites, right? I'm very interested in opposites. I'm very interested in paradoxes in life and thinking about those and reflecting on that. So I thought the juxtaposition of love and war was very interesting to me. And then you have issues of personal freedom, you know, exercise of personal freedom, acting against a milieu where you have colonialism, you have imperialism, and then you have the anti-imperialists debating with the imperialists. You have issues about feudalism, and then Americans trying to plant capitalism in a basically then feudal country, and then issues of tyranny and democracy. So a big question mark during that time for many people is, was the Philippines ready for democracy? I mean, I think we're still asking that today, right? Some of us are still asking that today. And then, issues of personal integrity, of personal conscience, working against social class, racial and religious prejudice, historical injustices, gender equality, and sexual orientation issues. So as a historical novelist, I love history. I love using history as a jumping board to talk about contemporary issues. Apart from the enjoyment that I get, and I'm sure most of you in FANHS, and even all of you who are with us today, I'm sure are interested in history. That's why you've joined us today. I'm sure we like reading about history because it teaches us about ourselves. Doesn't just teach us about the people during the historical period in which they acted, the subject of our study, but I think we get a lot about what we learn from them to know more about ourselves today. And maybe from that, we gain insights also on how to address our current problems. That's what interests me as a historical novelist. Okay. All right, so during the presentation, I'm just going to be showing a lot of pictures and just saying some highlights about them. So if you haven't seen the U.S. Army Transport Thomas, these are pictures of this beautiful, beautiful ship. And this is the way I actually described it in the novel. So let me just bring that up among my cheat sheets here. So this is the way the Thomasite describes the U.S. Army Transport Thomas. Eleanor turned her gaze toward the vessel, a colossal white knight on the water. Painted in crisp black bold script near the bow on starboard side was her name, U.S. Army Transport Thomas. I think that should be pronounced bow. I'm sorry. So painted in crisp black bold script near the bow on starboard side was her name, U.S. Army Transport Thomas. All of 467 feet long, with a carrying capacity of more than 7,000 gross tons, she was, according to the briefing packet from the Office of the Secretary of War, the newest, biggest transport ship in the service of the United States. The novel also will tell you a little bit about the previous history of the Thomas, which is very, very interesting, but I won't go into that right now. You can just read that in the novel. But one of the things that really interested me and why I spent the first few chapters describing the voyage, because some authors would probably just go right straight into the action in the Philippine Islands. But to me, it was important to me to describe the voyage. Why? Because we don't call them Thomasites for nothing, right? So to me, that voyage was very instrumental. It was a catalyst for the formation of their identity as a group. They were not homogeneous, by the way, and as I would see, these pictures show various pictures of the the Thomasite. They were young, they were old, they came from various ages. They came from various academic institutions, from the Ivy League schools to vocational schools to just, your ordinary regional state schools, and look at them. Look at how happy and joyful and so full of hope, and with probably dreaming of adventure, when they go to the Philippine Islands. So it interested me to know, one, what moved them, what were the conditions on the voyage, right? And these are all described in the Thomasite. So for instance, I don't know if you're like me, but when I'm reading a novel set in a historical period, I worry about basic things like, how was the toilet? How did they take a shower? How did they launder their clothes? And for women, how did they deal with their monthly periods? So that's all talked about. I don't know. I'm just, I guess, some would call that very anal, just really focus on these details. But to me, the devil is in the details, or I would like to say God is in the details, right? And it's in knowing those details about the historical period that makes history come alive for me. It makes it come alive for the ordinary person. And then we discover that we're not so different from the people of yesteryears. We're all human beings, and they may have had different big concerns, but basically deep down, we all share the same concerns, like how to eat, where to procure your food. So that all is kind of, I had fun describing all of that in the Thomasite. So like I said earlier, Bicol, which is the region, it's a southern province, southeastern, lower southeastern province of the Philippines, on the main island of Luzon. And these pictures show you some of the places that are very much an anchor in the plot of the novel. So we have Mayon Volcano, which is the most perfectly cone-shaped volcano in the world, and the Kagsawa Church ruins. Can you see my cursor moving? Yeah, okay. And then this on the lower photo is this is the approach to Legazpi port from Albaical. So this would have been the view that Eleanor would have seen from the steamer that she was riding in to go to Magayon. Because to go to Magayon, you have to land in Legazpi port first, and then she took a carretela. She took a carretela to Magayon. And then the stone steps leading to the Raga Church also feature in the novel. And notice the very elaborate decorative details on the facade of the Raga Church. It's said to be the Churigaresque architectural style, which is described as a very highly detailed, ornamental, ultra Baroque style that the Spaniards were very fond of. And oh, by the way, the stone of which the facade is made is made of volcanic stone. But here it looks white because it's whitewashed. They had a kind of paint that is easy to paint over because otherwise, if it's not painted, it would be charcoal gray because it's volcanic rocks. Okay, so those are some of the pictures. And okay, these two top pictures are of Huyop Cave. And this is what Eleanor calls the gate of hell. She kind of, when she sees the entrance with all the stalactites and the stalagmites, she sees them as like the canine teeth, of a monster's mouth about to devour her. and And my father brought us here when we're little kids. You know, can you just imagine what goes on in a child's mind when you're going into this cave, you know? And then you have to kind of take care not to step on the guano. You know what the guano is? Guano is like the bat droppings. Because actually, when dusk comes, there's lots of bats in the cave, and then they go out, they fly. You know, if you've ever been to Austin, Texas, you know the bats that are nesting underneath the bridge in Austin, Texas. That's how the bats look. They're like this whole army of bats just flying out of the cave. And it was, I don't know why I wasn't scared. To me, it felt like a magical land, like I entered to a, like Lord of the Rings, you know. So I really thank my father, which, by the way, happy Father's Day again to all of you. Just a little personal note here, but this is my Father's Day without my father, and I call him Papa because he passed away last Thanksgiving. And so, in a way, I wrote this novel to honor him. And feeling just a little bit emotional here because I'm talking about things that he did for us when we were kids that have now been so instrumental in the creation of this book, right? So just imagine the impact of a parent, of our parents on us. And this is the impact of my father on me, this beautiful, you know, my offering of beauty to the world, the Thomasite. And then he brought us to the Tiwi Hot Springs. Now, it's hot springs because the water is hot, right? And how does it get hot? It's when water gets heated by igneous rocks, live igneous rocks. These are volcanic rocks that are heated by the volcano's subterranean base, right? So the water passes through them and goes out through an outlet on the earth. And then so you have like these pictures where you could see the steam, and the whole place smells of sulfur, a little bit like sulfur. But there are actually pools in Tiwi, at least when we were kids, when we were there. I was there when I was 10 years old, and then again when I was 12 years old. And we swam in these pools, and it was really fun. It was warm but not scalding, so you could still enjoy it. And the way they did it was they combined cold water springs and the hot water from the igneous rocks, and they combined it and funneled them into a pool. And so you have a pool that's just heated right. So wonderful. It's one of my most memorable travels as a kid with my father and with my siblings. So, okay, so when you read the Thomasite, think about these pictures. All right, so we get to our first reading segment. Let me just, and this comes from the part of the novel, the chapter called Serpent in the Garden, entitled, if you notice, those who have the book already, that the book is divided into more than 20 chapters, and each chapter, I had fun naming each chapter. Each chapter's title could be like the title of a whole book. But anyway, so let me set up the scene for you. So in this scene that I'm going to read, Eleanor just arrived in Magayan the night before. And then she finds out that she got people from the town who were welcoming her. They assigned her a muchacha, which in other words means a maid. Well, she didn't think she needed a maid, and she fought it at first. But then they said, what, you don't want a maid? Do you want people to respect you or not? If you don't have a maid, people won't respect you. It's essentially like a status symbol to have a maid. And so, well, Eleanor is more or less independent-minded. So, so this other American who used to be a soldier, who was the first teacher there, because when the soldiers came, and they this is what I'm impressed about. they immediately embarked on educating the kids, Filipino kids. And at that time, there were still no teachers from, the mainland to join them. So some of the soldiers themselves actually became the first teachers. So this Texan soldier tells her, Miss Karsten, that, you trust me, you don't want to look or to look to these folks to be too different from them. If you want to blend in, you got to have a maid. So this maid is called Yolanda, and she's a Bicolana. And Yolanda has this predisposition for shrieking and screaming because she gets easily frightened. so so Eleanor just experienced this funny scene the night before where she wanted to get a cup of drinking water from the kitchen, and then despite her suggestion to Yolanda that she sleep somewhere else, not in the kitchen, Yolanda still slept in the kitchen on a banig, on a woven mat on the kitchen floor, and then Eleanor accidentally steps on her. So Yolanda shrieks, and then there's another scene the night before where Eleanor takes a shower, and she takes a shower with a tabo. You know what a tabo is, but in those days it was like a bamboo ladle, and then you just draw water from a jar, a clay jar, and then she pours the water over her head. So the maid teaches her how to take a shower Filipino style, right? Philippine style. But Eleanor forgets that the water isn't heated. So the water, when she pours it on her head, it's so super cold, right? It's because she was taking a shower in the evening. And then so she started screaming. Eleanor started screaming. And then Yolanda, because her mistress is screaming, runs to the bathroom. And just imagine this scene where you have this pale-skinned, blonde woman with very long hair, curly hair, and she is all naked. So the maid thinks that she's a bruja, which means a witch. So the maid starts screaming. So anyway, so this is Yolanda, okay? She's a shrieker. She's a screamer. And so the next morning, Eleanor is unpacking her clothes from her steamer trunk, and then she hears Yolanda scream again from the backyard, where Yolanda is supposedly like washing dirty, the laundry, right? So that's the context for this scene. So let me read this to you. Eleanor ran to the backyard where the screaming came from. She'd earlier glimpsed the maid setting down a wide scallop-edged tin basin full of clothes for washing under the artesian well spout. But Yolanda wasn't there. Instead, the muchacha was standing, seemingly frozen in place, under an ancient-looking tree. Eleanor slowly approached the maid, who was staring upward. She touched Yolanda's shoulder. Yolanda, why? What's the matter? The muchacha jumped behind Eleanor and pointed a trembling finger at something dangling from one of the tree branches. It looked terrifying. At the same time, it was magnificent. A magnificent snake. It was huge and long, although on account of Eleanor's almost zero knowledge about snakes, she wasn't sure if its size was normal for its kind. Its scalloped brown, black, and golden scales blended with the tree bark. No one would have noticed it if it didn't hang as it did. It seemed to be contemplating the two women, just as the two women were contemplating their next move. In all of her visions of a tropical paradise, Eleanor didn't count on encountering snakes as she probably should have. What was a Garden of Eden, after all, without the serpent? She thus resolved to learn about the local wildlife. For instance, was the snake venomous? In the meantime, it seemed a good idea to do as Yolanda did: remain still. Any abrupt movement could provoke it to strike. Both women jumped out of their skin when the snake suddenly spoke with a man's voice in a language that sounded to Eleanor as a combination of Spanish and possibly Vicolano. It sent Yolanda shrieking anew and hopping in fright. When the snake spoke again, Eleanor realized it wasn't the snake speaking, but a native man standing outside the chest-high bamboo fence directly behind the tree where the snake had coiled itself around one of its branches. He appeared taller than the average Filipino, but no taller than Eleanor by perhaps an inch or two. He wore a peasant's shirt with sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a straw hat that kept his face in shadow. All she could see was his round brown nose with slightly flared nostrils, full shapely russet lips, and square jaw. A verbal exchange transpired between him and Yolanda before the man climbed over the fence and jumped into the yard. Wait, wait! What does he think he's doing? Cried Eleanor. Yolanda, we don't know this man. But neither Yolanda nor the man bothered to address her concern. Instead, the stranger took off his hat and hung it on the fence, slipped off his leather sandals, folded the hem of his long pantaloons up to his big calves, and climbed the tree like a cat. He crawled on the branch on which the snake had coiled itself, pried it off the tree limb, and to Eleanor's astonishment, draped the reptile around his neck and jumped off the tree, landing solidly on his feet. When he glanced up at Eleanor, he twisted his lips into a smile and winked. She noted his dark, sparkling eyes, his black, wavy, jaw-length hair, and his sinewy forearms, flexing as he pushed his hair from his face and tucked it behind his ears. He put on his hat and sandals and approached the women, holding out the snake to them as if it were an offering. As he stepped forward, Eleanor stepped backward. No, no, please, we don't want it, she exclaimed, shaking her head. Yolanda screamed again and ran to the house. The man replied with what again sounded like a mix of Spanish and the local language. When Eleanor failed to respond, he continued, to her great amazement, in English. No poison. Good eat. Taste like chicken. He smiled and mimicked pushing food into his mouth with his fingers, chewing and rubbing his belly. Eleanor waved her hands in declination. Oh, thank you, but no, senor. Could you just please put it away somewhere? Like in those woods, perhaps. Yes, far away from here. She gestured in sweeping, shooing motions. The man tilted his head, as though trying to comprehend what she said, looking quite amused. Without saying more, he walked past her toward the street and left, whistling a happy tune with the docile snake wrapped around his shoulders like a stole. Senor, excuse me, senor, Eleanor hollered, but the man did not look back as he disappeared into the dusty haze of another warming day. That's it. So can you imagine seeing this python and how it frightened those women? Okay. So in writing this novel, I claim my authorial right to creative liberty. And how did I do that? Well, first of all, I have to say that the dates of major historical events are, to my best knowledge, accurate. And I really strove to do that in the major historical events. There are two exceptions where I exercise my creative prerogative by changing the context of two minor yet relevant historical facts. Number one is the day when the Teatro Nacional would have been open for performances. Now in the Philippines, the letter C, we pronounce it as, you know, instead of the na, the of the Catalan Spaniards. There are various dialects in Spain itself, right? And so in the Philippines, we take on the one that actually pronounces the S's and the C's, and not pronounce them as if one had a lisp. I'm sorry. I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of protests from some Spaniards here, so please forgive me. I didn't mean that in a derogative way. It was just for fun. If you know Filipinos, you know that they're pillos and pillas. And what that means is we're jokers. We love to joke all the time, right? Because we're about having fun and we're such a joyful people, okay? And then, so because, the Teatro Nacional actually, the theater was then undergoing renovations and opened for performances only later in the year, when I had Aurelia Tolentino, who, by the way, is a Kapampangan author like me. He's also a Filipino national hero, and he wrote this play called Kahapon, Ngayon at Bukas, which literally translated in English means yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And actually, there's a picture later on I'll show. He made a Kapampangan version of this play. But the Kapampangan version, interestingly enough, is a novel. So he turned his play into a novel in Kapampangan. So the premiere performance of Tolentino's play actually was in 1903, not in January 1902 as I had it in the novel, and it premiered in the Teatro Libertad, not in the Teatro Nacional. Now, the reason why I did this is because I thought that Aurelia Tolentino's play enhanced the story that I was trying to tell in the Thomasite. And for this, I thought it was worth it. The interest, and the other thing I like about the Teatro Nacional is originally it was built in a round form. So to me, it kind of is reminiscent of Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, in London. Although at that time, in 1902, of course, Shakespeare's Globe Theatre was long gone by then because it was burned down. Interestingly enough, in the 1600s, it was burned down because of protests by a Puritan Christian group that called the performances in the plays of Shakespeare obscene. So no one knows who actually burned the theater, but it was interesting that it got burned when it was this Christian group was trying to protest against Shakespeare's plays. And then that theater then became the H.T. Hashim National Cycle Track, because it was round. So it was a cycle track. The people rode their bicycles around the track. And then later on in 1890, it was turned into the Manila Grand Opera House by this Italian impresario called Balzo Fiore. And then later on that year, even had an Italian opera group perform. So this is Aurelia Tolentino, and this is the Kapampangan version of his play that was staged at the Teatro Libertad, which was staged at the Teatro Nacional in the Thomasite. And this is actually an interesting newspaper clipping of the arrest of Tolentino. He was accused of sedition by the Americans, or insurrection, because the play of Tolentino was quite what would you say, it was quite rousing against the Americans. It was about how the Filipinos were yet again being exploited and being oppressed by their new colonizers, the Americans. So but it's called Kahapon Ngayon at Bukas because it also delved into the historical past of the Filipinos when they were under at first, this is interesting to me, that they were struggling against Chinese hegemony. because China was trying to occupy the Philippines. And isn't that interesting considering today's news, right? The past repeats itself, right? If you, in my book, the book actually starts with a quote from George Santayana. He's a philosopher, but he's not just any philosopher. But anyway, Santayana says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And this is why studying history is so fascinating to me, because I look to the study of history as for insights on how we can address our current problems. And so, and oh, by the way, another thing about George Santayana, did you know that he has Philippine roots? His mother was a daughter of a Spanish official who was assigned in the Philippine Islands during the Spanish rule. And then George Santayana was born in America, but then he also went to study in Spain. And so he's known as a Spanish American philosopher. Okay. Now going back to Tolentino, he was sentenced to prison by, can you believe it, by an American judge called a Judge Smith. And so please, everyone, I have no relationship with this Judge Smith, okay? That's just, I want that to be very clear. My ancestor was not the one who, well, I am a Smith by marriage, by the way, so, you know. But just to be clear, you know, we're no relations with that Judge Smith that sent Aurelia Tolentino to prison. So anyway, here on the top left photo was, I couldn't get any pictures anywhere of the Manila Grand Opera House as it existed in 1902, when it later opened in 1902. But this is actually William Howard Taft addressing the Philippine Assembly, the first Philippine Assembly at the Manila Grand Opera House. And then on the right, look how beautiful this theater is, Teatro Libertad. Okay, so this is actually the theater where Tolentino staged his play. Okay, and then, well, I'm sad to state, my friends, but the lower pictures, they're what the Manila Grand Opera House is now. It's a casino. So, I mean, and that's why I really believe in the great value that historical preservation groups do for our communities. Because without historical preservation groups, this is what happens. You have, and actually this casino is owned, some of its owners are Chinese. So not that I have anything against the Chinese, except for the way they're trying to occupy the Philippine Islands today, because I am actually part Chinese too. So I'm actually a mutt. I have, of course, indigenous Filipino blood. I have Chinese blood. A great-great-grandmother was a full-blooded Chinese. I have Spanish blood. The Grajedas are said to originate from Seville, Spain. And actually, I have a very interesting story on that. If we have time later on, I'll tell you about it. And then I also have a French blood. Comes from the maternal line of my father's family in Bicol. Comes from a French missionary couple that settled a forest in the Bicol region. So anyway, all right. So you cannot talk about the Thomasite without talking about a little bit about the Philippine Revolution. And like I said in the beginning of this presentation, Jose Rizal's novels, Noli Me Tangere here, and El Filibusterismo. And oh, by the way, I read both books in Spanish in the University of the Philippines. Can you imagine reading these books in the original Spanish language? And I cannot believe this, but I was writing whole essays in Spanish when I was in the UP. Yeah, I had one of the most wonderful Filipino Spanish professors in UP. And then, of course, in high school, we read Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo in Tagalog. So I read both in Spanish and Tagalog. So these books had an impact on me, right? I've been thinking about those characters all throughout my life since I read the books. And Jose Rizal, whether you like it or not, you know, some people don't much like Rizal because he actually said no to joining the revolution. But the fact is, his writings inspired the Katipunan. And the Katipunan, well, I don't like to call, it's really funny. As an American, I get a really weird feeling when I say that our revolution was the KKK, because the KKK has different connotations in America, right? But really, the KKK was the kataas-taasan, kagalang-galangan, and then there. Let me see. I have it somewhere here. Kataas-taasan, kagalang-galangan, katipunan ng mga anak ng bayan. And so this is the seal of the revolution. And it was started by Andres Bonifacio. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have included a picture of Andres Bonifacio here. But later on, the final leader was General Emilio Aguinaldo. He was also the first Philippine president of a free Philippines, a Philippines that was freed from the Spaniards. And these are the different flags of the revolution. And another thing that features in the novel is actually, because I had to describe it, okay? Because, you know, Eleanor was falling in love with this guy whom she suspects was the leader of the local insurrection. And again, to Americans, it was just an insurrection. But to the Filipinos, it was no less than the continuation of the Philippine Revolution for independence. Okay, so different memberships had different insignias and masks and color insignias, right? And so you go from the, you know, the basic membership is as katipon, and then you rise up depending on how many you recruit into the movement, into a kawal. So you have the green mask, the katipon just has the black mask with the pyramid and the what's this, the alphabets, you know, the letters of the katipunan. And then the leader, or the bayani, just has an eye mask in red, and then with a sash banded in green. And this is the dreaded Filipino bolo. Okay, the bolo. If some of you may have seen my reading at the Orcas Island Lit Fest, and I actually read a scene where the bolo featured prominently there, and I explained all about the bolo. But the bolo, which, as you know, among us Filipinos, it's what we use in the wilderness, right? To cut, you know, kawayan and bamboo and, you know, trees. But it also became, because it was the only thing available to Filipinos, it was their weapon during the revolution. But American soldiers dreaded the Filipinos' bolo more than they dreaded the Spaniards' gun and bayonet. You know why? Because of rampant news stories about how the Filipino revolutionaries actually hacked their enemies chopped them into pieces. So the bolo was as efficacious in cutting down a man as it was in cutting down trees, they said. And so all the Americans in the United States, when they started reading about the stories about the savage Filipinos armed with the bolo that can chop you to pieces, it really inflamed calls to quickly pacify the Philippine insurrection and to tame the savage Filipinos. And these are the savage Filipinos. They were just smart and wise. Why? Because they started with no shoes, anything they can wear. And then they progress into more uniforms. You know why? Because when the Spaniards started fleeing, right? Then they raided and looted the Spanish commissaries. So they took the uniforms of the Spaniards and wore them. And so they started getting, their uniforms started to have a more uniform look. And then some of them even, the officers started wearing these more distinguished uniforms, in blue and khaki and all that, right? Okay. All right. So the coming of the Thomasites really was part of this whole big debate between the US imperialists and the US anti-imperialists. US in the elections of 1900, the ones who were running for president were William McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. So McKinley is identified with the imperialist side because they believe in expanding, sharing American democracy with the world, and they started by acquiring the Hawaiian Islands, and then Guam and Puerto Rico, and then although they did not get Cuba, they did maintain a base there. And William Jennings Bryan, including Mark Twain, our famous iconic American author Mark Twain, they're part of the group called the Anti-Imperialist League. Okay, so the poster here between McKinley won those elections, by the way, right? Which is why the Thomasites came to the Philippines. He put out a call, his administration put out a call for volunteer teachers to go to the Philippines. Why? Well, as we Americans always like to say, to win hearts and minds, right? So the Americans was the benevolent face to win the hearts and minds of Filipinos, starting with the children, right? And I would say that for many of the Thomasites, that mission was real. They really believed in that mission. They really believed they were doing good, right? Although some of them knew, like we all know now, that it was really part of the way the U.S. tried to assimilate the Filipinos more as a U.S. colony. So the middle poster was McKinley's presidential campaign poster of 1900. Now, why is Rudyard Kipling here when he is British, right? Well, Kipling was an author and a poet, and he wrote this poem called The White Man's Burden, right? And it was this poem that was instrumental in the call for Americans to go spread the blessings of American democracy to the world, because they considered it their manifest destiny to Christianize the colored nations of the world and to tame the savages of the world. And let me just read you the first stanza of Kipling's poem, and you'll get the gist. So this is The White Man's Burden, a poem that was published in 1899, and this is stanza 1. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So the Filipinos were the new-caught sullen peoples whom they considered half devils and half children. And so Americans really did believe that they were civilizing Filipinos by going to the Philippines and teach them. All right, let's just move more quickly here. Just, you know, when you read the novel, and these pictures were very helpful to me in like how was a sergeant of the U.S. State Volunteers clothed? What did that look like? So this picture is was very helpful for me, and these are the U.S. you know, the privates and the subordinates of the sergeant. They're about to board a ship. And note, this is what I found really fascinating. You know, these shirts, they're going to the Philippines, right? Like 100-degree weather. You know what these shirts are? They're woolen. They're woolen. And their socks were woolen. and their trousers were woolen. And then the officers had this sack coat, as they called it, and it was all thick wool. And that is why a great number of the fatalities of the Philippine-American War was not so much with the conflict, the shooting and the actual battles themselves, but many Americans died from heat exhaustion and from tropical diseases that came from just the kind of weather they did not expect in the tropical country. And that's why you'll find one of my characters then complaining, how come this lack of foresight, right? I mean, comparing them with the British and the Portuguese and the Spaniards, who all had warm weather uniforms, canvas and cotton uniforms. This was what the Americans wore. And then later on I'll show a book that was very helpful in telling me all the different pieces of clothing of the American soldiers, and their socks were woolen. So a big nuisance to them was all the athlete's foot disease they had, because their socks were always soaked with their sweat. And there was never enough time to dry them and to launder their socks. But these sailors, I imagine, would have been like what the sailors wear on the US-AT Thomas. And these are actually the soldiers that came with Commodore George Dewey, who, as they call, is the conqueror of Manila, because he defeated the Spanish Navy in Manila Bay. So I thought you'd find that interesting, just seeing their uniforms. So I call this my clashing perspective slide.
Yeah, we're getting close on time, so.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So should I just go quickly over the photos? McKinley was, I probably would not be able to read some of these. Okay. I'm just going to go quickly through the pictures, okay? Because I think you'll find this interesting. These are just pictures of the school buildings that the Thomasites built. Some of them had metal roofs and some had nipa grass roofs. Eleanor combined both, in the novel. Okay, I'm not going to have time to talk about history, but all of these prominent historical characters are featured in the novel. And one of those that I mentioned, I would draw your attention to here is General William A. Colby, which through some really detailed research I was glad I was able to make, I found was actually in charge of the Bicol region, because I was trying to find out who was in charge of the Bicol region during the time of the novel. Jacob Smith, as you know, is called Howling Jake. He is responsible for the Balangiga Samar massacre, and that's also taken up in the novel. Funston captured Aguinaldo. Elihu Root was the Secretary of War. William Taft was the head of the Philippine Commission, but he also became the president after Theodore Roosevelt, who took over when McKinley was assassinated and George Dewey was there. Okay. All right, the next two slides, I'm going to go quickly over them, but just, sensitive slides. So these are photos of, this one is a postcard that was actually sold. It's staged, but it showed you how they did the water cure, which we call now waterboarding, the torturing prisoners. And then this is another illustration of that. But this features in the novel. When I'm talking, the images that really haunted Eleanor are images of Filipinos' bodies stacked up in trenches after they were massacred. This is the Balangiga massacre, and this is the Budajo massacre in Jolo. Okay, now atrocities weren't one-sided. Filipinos also committed atrocities. And there were not only American witnesses, but to me, what I found the most convincing were Filipino national heroes who themselves confirmed that the Filipinos, well, Filipino insurgents also committed atrocities. And they were known basically for a couple of things: burying their prisoners alive and in anthills, and also mutilation through their bolos. The historical footnote here about San Ignacio Church, I think I covered this in my historical notes, so I won't go into that now for lack of time. But if you guys go into the back book matter, there are two QR coded segments, and I explain how the San Ignacio Church in Intramuros is no longer there and all the history about that. But that figures prominently in the novel. The Filipino architect who built that church, and the Filipino atelier carvers of wood that really look at the interiors of the San Ignacio. Bombing of Manila, World War II, decimated most of Manila. And these are now the ruins of that San Ignacio Church. Okay, I'm just gonna briefly say three things about the cholera epidemic that I found interesting. There are three things about the cholera epidemic in 1902 Philippines that I found very similar to the COVID pandemic. Okay, number one is the resistance of people to quarantine measures. They also did that then. The tracing of the origins of the disease to China. In this case, they found the cholera strain in Guangzhou, and then they labeled it as Asiatic cholera. And then that the poor and marginalized carried a disproportionate amount of the fatalities. All things that we experience in the COVID pandemic. So I also covered that in the QR coded historical notes. Just to give you some pictures of all the books that inform my writing. So these are the two main ones: To Islands Far Away and Bearers of Benevolence. Of course, Mary Fee's Woman's Impressions of the Philippines. Actually, one of the characters of the novel is inspired by the persona of Mary Fee. If you read, and I've read this whole book, right? If you read this book, Mary Fee's personality really shines in her writing. Well, Mary Fee is this kind of arrogant American woman who considers herself superior to Filipinos, and she used her position as a Thomasite. She didn't arrive on the US-AT Thomas. She arrived on an earlier vessel called the Beaufort. But she used her position as an American teacher and as a white American as her source of authority when she was performing, whatever she was doing in the Philippines. She's a fellow Michiganer. Actually, she went to U of M like I did. So, so to me, she's just interesting. Just look at how a woman who was a second-class citizen in her own country, because there was no suffrage yet for American women at that time, right? But American woman was smart enough to grab upon her status as a teacher and as a white American to claim authority. And that is what she used when she was in the Philippines. Okay, Dean Worcester, Dean Worcester, there's a whole history about him, but I had my characters read his book because it was only his book that I found was available to the Thomasites for any kind of information background about the Philippines. So I had my characters reading the Philippine Islands. Oh, the Boxer Codex was very instrumental in informing me about the clothing of the early Filipinos that I describe in some of the myths and folklore that I feature in the novel. And this I got from the Ayala Museum when I was there in 2018. And this is a book by my friend Feliz Prudente Santa Maria, who is a very well-known and very highly respected cultural his ethnographer, I would say. Well, that's probably not enough because she does a lot of things. But this book was very instrumental in informing me what elitist Spanish Filipinos ate when they feasted, right? Okay. So, and this book was instrumental in informing me about the uniforms of the various combatants. This book, Civilian Lawton's 1819, was instrumental in telling me about the raw conditions of the American soldier in the Philippines. Okay, Hawaii Story, I read the whole book. I got a copy of this as a PDF from the internet. And Hawaii Story is very, very much related to the Philippines. I would just, go through that. The Pali outlook that is featured in the novel is where King Kamehameha, the first king or emperor of the United Hawaiian Islands, forced 1,500 enemy combatant warriors to their deaths down from this gorge. So that's featured in the novel too. I won't go into the book really delves into the history of the Hawaii and of the Gang of 13 who were instrumental in ousting the last Hawaiian king. Mr. Henry Waterhouse, the Thomasites, attend a reception that he hosted in their honor on their last night in Honolulu. So it's all in the novel too. I won't go into that, but if you go to page 36 to 40 of the novel, it talks about all that history. Just Malakas and Maganda, what's interesting about that is the only myth and folklore that preaches about the equality of men and women. And oh, by the way, the Tigmamanukan that pecked on the giant bamboo, that then from where Malakas and Maganda, the first man and woman in Philippine folklore, emerged, is not really the Sarimanok of the Moros or the Muslim. It is this, the Asian fairy bluebird, which is a real bird, by the way. Okay, the Asog is a babaylan, who is a man dressed in woman's clothes. Okay, I won't say anything more. Okay, there's just so much here. These are the chuggies also described in the novel. And this is how Thomasites traveled in the mountain province. They traveled on sedan chairs. See here, this is a, this one, I have to show you this. This is a Muslim wedding in Holo, circa 1930s, but look at the bride. She wears a Chinese headdress and wears kind of like a sari, and then she wears patent leather shoes. Just shows the eclectic culture of the Muslims during that time. And actually the novel is in an earlier historical period. Now, this one I found a little disturbing. These are Muslim child brides, and these are also explained in the letter of Arabella to Eleanor in the novel. But look at their painted faces and the Chinese headdresses, right? Okay, if you don't know by now that the reason why Intramuros is called a citadel means literally a fortress within a fortress. So you can see here, and there's a scene in the novel that talks about this. So when you go to that scene in the novel, just look at these two walls. You have an outer wall, and then within Intramuros itself is the fortress where the Spanish soldiers were. And they had cannons all around pointed at Manila Bay. All right. I know we're lacking time, so I'm just going to rely on the questions and answers. And while we're waiting for the questions and answers, I'll just briefly scan through these photos because I think they're beautiful, right? The camisa at saya, which consists of no less than 4 pieces of clothing. Terry, it's your, okay, last but not least, this is my collection. It's also described in the novel, the collection of earrings, and I was so fortunate to get this in the Philippines in 2018. But this is a real antique tambourine, and this is what Filipino, Spanish, Catholic ladies wore, because in the glass case they would put a little souvenir of their favorite saint. So this is what they would wear with the camisa and saya, and actually. Look at the Thomasite teachers. They love wearing the camisa at saya. Okay, I'll end there. Back to you, Terry. Sorry we didn't have enough time.
Well, I mean, you did cover.
I hope I made sense. I feel like I just
yes.
went through it like a breeze.
And there's quite a few comments in the chat by Brian. He appears to have a lot of good information also on the history of what you were talking about.
Yeah.
But does anybody have any specific questions that you'd like to ask Victoria?
Oh, you know
Um,
what? Instead of asking a question, I know this is important for many Filipinos, for me to point out, but I'm going to go back to that picture of the Escuela Municipal. Escuela Municipal in here. Okay, this is the Escuela Municipal, and it was a girls' training school during the Spanish era. And this was all part of the public education system that by royal decree was established in the Philippines during the Spanish era. But the trouble with with the Spanish public education system is it was mostly available to the rich. And what they taught the girls was basically through one book, the Doctrina Cristiana, which is basically, a Christian doctrine book, because girls went to school not to become learned. They went to school to become good Catholic wives and mothers, and homemakers. And so what they were taught was mostly, sewing, cooking, all of the home economic arts, right? And so, and also, I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of rap from my fellow Filipinos who are very much into Spanish right now. But most Filipinos did not, I'm sorry to say, per my research, did not speak Spanish. What they spoke were the regional dialects mixed in with some Spanish words that they heard their masters speak, the hacienderos, So contrary to the misconception that Spanish was the language of Filipinos, and even the Thomasites discovered this. And why do I know this? Because I read their memoirs. I read all the major personal accounts of Thomasites, and most of them were surprised because they studied Spanish in order to prepare themselves for going to the Philippines. And then they were so surprised. Like, for example, Eleanor goes to Bicol and she discovers that most of the people there spoke Bicolano, or like a mix, a hybrid mix of Bicolano dialect mixed with Spanish words. So yes, there was. And the public education system under the Spaniards was mostly geared towards the religious. It was a very religious educational system. And so when the Americans came, they established a public education system as an alternative to that very religious-oriented, Catholic-oriented religious education system in the Philippines. So they tried to establish a secular public education. So I'd love to have questions. Ask me questions.
Elena, do you have anything that you liked? Because since
Elena, you're muted, my dear.
Let's see.
Okay, here we go. I do have a lot of questions. Number one, I saw it right away that there's a scene. The dining scene is already a Noli Me Tangere scene. The reason I feel for that is I performed the role of Doña Victorina. So I smacked people with my abanico.
Yes.
The book is a literary journey because it is set at a time when not even a regular Filipino at that time knows what's in store for them.
Right.
It was that transition between 400 years plus of being colonized, and then here comes another colonizer, and it's the anatomy of being a conquered people.
Right.
And you looked at, and now it's time to look at every character. And then I find that you had a keen sense of empathy on being a stranger in a foreign land. So your Eleanor is actually that other perspective of being well-intentioned and has a mission, as you know, as she had accepted her mission impossible, especially for Eleanor being a woman and carrying a huge responsibility. I mean, any woman would be given a huge responsibility at any time, but your construct of Eleanor is something very empathetic.
Thank you.
And I love that. I love that part that I can be an Eleanor if I want to. If I were to pack tomorrow for another land, I will have some ideas based on how you constructed your Eleanor character. And then the adventure follows. So that's the keen sense of empathy on your part. And also because of the historical background, I'm seeing it from a Filipino perspective and saying, yeah, we need education. But what is education at that time
Right.
for our children? What is my aspiration if I were a parent? And let them go with the Americana over there in that hut and let
Right.
them learn, because I don't know. I don't have the answers. The Spaniards just left. And now here are Americans. How does that feel during that time? So
Right.
that's it. That's my my bookend to your
Yeah. Thank you so much, Elena, for that feedback, and I thank you so much. I really appreciate you mentioning that. But let me connect it with one thing, okay? And this is a really interesting experience I had when I was when I was querying literary agents and publishers for this book. One of the people that I queried was a Filipino American literary agent in Los Angeles. And I thought that she would readily connect with this book, right? I mean, how could you not if you knew our history? But you know, she rejected this book, and you know why she rejected it? And this is where I say identity politics has gone awry. Okay? You know, this debate between identity politics and cultural appropriation, all these issues. Well, that happened to me through a Filipino American literary agent who told me that she thought it was a shame that I didn't tell the story from the point of view of a Filipino. Why did you choose your heroine as a white American? She was all up in arms about it. Okay. And so my answer to her is this. If I use the persona and personality of a white American teacher because it was only from her perspective could we tell the story of the American Thomasites from the voyage to their experiences in the Philippines, because no Filipino would have been privy to that information and experience. But think about that. A Filipino rejected my book on the basis of identity politics argument. Right?
God bless her.
And it is a Caucasian American from Florida publisher who readily got what this book is about. And oh my gosh, when she told me, Victoria, I want to publish your book because this book is important. This is the kind of book that is important to share with the world. So you put those reactions side by side. Isn't it ironic?
Identity
Right?
politics. Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And also, I'm a fiction author. I can use my imagination and my empathy in order to create a character with whom I'm not of the same race. That is my creative liberty, my creative prerogative as an author, right? Now, it's different if you're writing memoir or nonfiction. That is when you can say, you must be sensitive to cultural appropriation. But I say, if you have a good imagination and you have researched very well, who's to say you cannot write a character in the persona of someone who doesn't belong to your race or your culture?
Yes.
That just doesn't make sense. Okay, I'm so glad you brought it up because as you can see, I still feel very strongly about this.
Mhm. Okay.
Anyway.
Um,
Yes.
Brian, did you want to say anything? I mean, you have a lot of good comments.
Yeah, I concur with Marilyn on that Thomasite novel would be a great movie. It's like a Hollywood film / Philippine film as well.
Oh yes, I am on the lookout for anyone who wants to make a film because I've actually started writing the film script, but I'm open to someone else, screenwriters writing a screenplay out of this because you know how, Brian, I can't see your handsome face. Can I see your handsome face?
Hello, it's
Hi,
me.
Brian. Thank you so.
Hi.
Brian is one of the early readers of this book, and so I thank you so much, Brian. You know, anyone, if you can help me, I just, because we don't want to give it to just anyone, right? It has to be right because this kind of story deserves no less than the cinematic treatment of War and Peace, Gone with the Wind, you know. I mean, even the cinematography of Lord of the Rings, I would say, in order to feature the beauty of the Philippine Islands, right? So yes, when I write books, it's always with this in mind. Actually, Brian, is that a movie can actually be made out of it. So when I describe scenes and landscapes, and when I describe the persona of a character, I write them with that in mind. If this were a movie, what would the camera zoom in, right? And then what would be the conflict in the personality of this character that any Oscar award winning actor or actress would love to perform? I even had an idea of who would play the different characters, but I won't say that so that I don't limit my choices later on. Thanks for showing yourself. I really
Welcome. You're
appreciated it.
welcome.
Does anybody else have any other comments or questions for Victoria? I thought this was, I mean, I really like how the history and the research that went behind all of this, because to me it's very historical, even though it's fiction. So
Yeah,
Yes,
the
yeah,
consultants would be maybe that film would be shown on the 125th anniversary of the arrival of USAT Thomas in the Philippines.
yeah, actually today is result day, and then so July 21 is when they left. July 23rd is when they left San Francisco Bay, and they arrive in Manila Bay on August 21. So
Yeah,
on August 21, that would be what, the
2026.
127.
Yeah, 2026.
Right, right. Oh,
yeah.
and by the way, people who are taking care of the Manila North Cemetery grave site of all the American Thomasites have reached out to me that the place apparently is needing a lot of repairs and spruce ups because it's kind of
Yeah.
yeah, it's in a sorry state. So
Yeah,
anyone,
so you can also
those,
consult with the National Historical Commission of the Philippines as well, NHCP.
which one is that, Brian?
NHCP, National Historical Commission of the Philippines.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
And HTP, yes.
yes. Yeah, so they need a lot of help to preserve all of these historical gems of ours as a people, you know. So and I wanna state that although the Thomasite, I strove to really be authentic and accurate in all of the history that I feature in the Thomasite. Please remember it's fiction, and if I got anything imperfectly, please forgive me. It's just one of the travails of a fiction author. You know, they say an author always has this ideal, perfect vision of the book in our heads, right? And what actually comes out most of the time is but a mere shadow of that vision. I must say the Thomasite was very close to my vision of this book. So I hope everyone enjoys it. And I would you can find me on social media. I'm on Facebook, on Twitter, I'm on Instagram. I would love to continue the dialogue with you. If you have questions and feedback and suggestions, I would very much be interested in continuing the conversation with you. You know where to reach me. I'm not hiding. Although I'm a hermit author, you can reach me anytime on social media.
Mhm. Well, we thank you very much for doing this today. I mean, this was great. And we thank you all who attended. And yeah, reach out to Victoria if you've got more questions. And we thank you guys. This was a perfect educational and, historic and a very interesting. I like this. I wish we could go on and keep discussing and things.
May I just quickly say, Terry, to those of you who will be in the Southern California area on October 21, I will be. I've been invited, and thanks so much to the Philippine Expressions Bookshop. I will be doing a reading and book signing there on October 21. We just haven't decided on the exact time, but I'd love to see some of you there, and I'd love to sign my book and write a little bit something there inside in your copy of the book. So thank you, Terry. Thanks for allowing me to announce that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And
Welcome.
anytime, Victoria, you do have anything that you'd like to pass on to people? I mean, I can, always email it out to the people on our list. Like I said, this will go up on our YouTube channel. And then what I also do at the end of this month for July, I always send out a MailChimp to our mailing list, and it will have that, hey, don't forget, you can see this video, from our June presentation. So hopefully I remind everybody enough. So
I'm very open because the book has everything, right? Every possible issue or matter you want to discuss.
yes.
So maybe after a year, when most everyone has read the book, I'd be open for another round where maybe we could kind of like have a deeper conversation on the themes and issues of the book. So just think about it. I mean,
Okay.
I'm at your service.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. And thank you, Victoria.
Thank you.
And we hope to see everybody again in the future. So thank you again. And we will see you. And I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.
Thank you.